So I've always been interested in the arts. Some of my earliest memories, I knew I always wanted to be an artist. I just feel, I think I had an innate awareness of it as a child. It's just something that's always been familiar to me. It's always been a little bit disturbing, the idea of death and eternity. And it's almost like a childlike fascination with the macabre or the layers of life and what might be beyond life. When I grew up, I did apply to SCAD when I first graduated high school, and I was accepted, but I couldn't scrounge up enough money in loans to go. So the following year, instead, I did a class with the Maryland Institute College of Art in Italy, where we studied plein air painting on the Bay of Naples. And that was just a month that changed my life. I fell in love with Italy and with, classical art. And I went back 2 years later to learn language, and I studied at the University for Foreigners in Perugia. And then I transferred to a 4-year university in Rome called John Cabot University, and I got my degree in art history. And then I stayed after and interned with the U.S. Embassy in the Fine Arts Department with the curator, Valeria Brunori. And that was also a really special period. I got into archival research, and I actually did my thesis on the cemetery there, go figure. And then after that, the economy kind of collapsed, and I fell into this rut. I went to New York, and I was stapling bedding together in a showroom. I didn't even know that was a thing. I was living on a friend's couch on the Lower East Side, and I could only take so much. Eventually, I ended up in Arkansas, which is a long story too, and I met my husband there, and he moved to Savannah with me. It was either come with me or lose me, because we just met, and I applied for graduate school at SCAD, and I knew that I was going to get back on track with my roots and fulfill the dream that I always had. So I did it some 20 years later, and now it's just wrapping up. So "Tell me who you're haunting and I'll tell you who you are" is actually a phrase I read in an anthology. It was one of the Whitechapel art history books that deals with different subjects in art theory. And it refers to a quote from Andre Breton's surrealist novel called Nadja. And it's a surrealist novel, so it's a little bit out there, but it's about this haunting, obsessive presence of this woman, Nadja, in the author's life, and his questioning their reality or their lack thereof the reality. And when I read the phrase, it just struck me. It was something I wrote down at the time, and I kept going back to it. And it poses a question rather than answers one, so I feel like, for me, that's what good art is too. It's something that doesn't give you everything at face value. It leaves something unsaid. So your mind has to fill in the blanks, so it becomes more engaging. And I feel like that's what the title does as well. A lot of these paintings are quite large, as you can see, so I had to get a trailer to move everything back, and it's just labor, lifting and lugging, and all I do is move things lately, I feel like. And then the mantle, of course, is the heaviest piece in the installation, so I was fortuitous enough to have exhibitions assist with that. And the wallpaper too, that was a lot of work because I designed that. It's based off those paintings over there, repeat pattern. So that was also really rewarding. So the mantle, there'll be a bunch of limbs coming out of that. It'll be a portal for nature to come into the room. It's kind of like the host, and it's sort of infecting the rest of the space. So there'll be little traces of nature here and there. And then I'm gonna do some flowers and some candles, and it's almost like an altar, like nature altar. So it's death and decay, but also life and beauty. this piece is called Green Tea, and it's based loosely off of a short story by Irish horror writer J. Sheridan Le Fanu. That story is very horrific, and I didn't concentrate on the dark aspects of it, but I did use the idea of peeling back the veil between the living and the dead and playing up this idea of nonlinear time. So it's actually based off of my grandmother's house. It's a colonial house dating back to 1710. And I spent a lot of childhood nights there, and she used to read to me. And this is a photo of me from maybe 10 years ago. And that's my little cat that had just passed away when I started painting this. Lost her to breast cancer. And my grandmother, as a young woman, and she was starting to fade away in real life. She was suffering from dementia, and while I started painting it, she was diagnosed with leukemia and died within 2 weeks. So while I was painting it, she passed away, and that was really hard. And my family was all there in the house with her. It was very much like the old way. It didn't even feel like a real event. And after she passed away, I just I couldn't stop painting the painting because it was a way of keeping her alive. And also the cat, she's been in, 4 or 5 of these paintings so far. And she just kept turning up. And then the one we'll talk about later was, I finally decided I could let her rest. So the monkey up there is actually an ode to the J. Sheridan Le Fanu story, the first publication. It was one of the cover images. The ghosts in the fireplace, they just kind of showed up. And again, a little bit of whimsy for a somewhat dark subject matter. And this is actually a painting in Alex Raskin's antique shop that I just really liked. I envisioned that there are 3 doctors. Like, I have a whole story about these guys, and I decided to hang them up there. It's another situation. It's just kind of how I work. I just stop after a certain point, and it can be in the strangest place, but for her it makes sense too, because her foot's not fully rendered, and she's the least rendered figure in the whole piece. And it is because she's kind of drifting between these worlds. And, even when she was in dementia, she was there, but she wasn't always there. And like I said, she was just hanging between these worlds. And actually, she was supposed to be half rendered because she's the one I lost. I ended up switching them because even though he's still with us, like just holding on to this something that's ethereal, and I thought that was even more touching in the composition than having it vice versa, like trying to hold on to something as it dissipates. So this is my salon wall. I've always wanted to have a salon wall. This is the same woman as a young woman. This is my grandmother. Her name was Ruth, and my mother as a baby. It's the first baby I've ever painted. I kind of wanted them to also feel like they were just either dissipating or emerging, so I used this high tonal unity, very much the same colors, and just little pokes, little bits of the underpainting peeking through. Then we have a couple prints, this one and the one in the upper right-hand corner. This is my woodblock print called Nostalgia, and it's just a pensive figure on Tybee. And the one on the top right there is called The Wild, and it's another kind of post-apocalyptic chaos scene that I just kind of let the materials, that's an etching. So when you put it in the acid baths and stuff, you get some interesting techniques. And I like that whatever they're looking at that's so horrible is not in the picture frame, and I kind of like to leave that up to the viewer. And if you look outside the window in that piece, you'll see Dresden after the bomb. So that's just a little detail that most people wouldn't know about. And then jumping back over here, this is called Sail to Me, Let Me Enfold You, and that's my siren. And this is the Cockspur Lighthouse up there. One of the fun things about this piece, and actually 2 of the ones we talked about in the beginning, they have artifacts embedded in them from Bonaventure. So if you get up close to this, you'll see impressions of moss, little pieces of dirt, and the frame, which was in pretty bad shape, is also part of the piece. This is the only one that has the paint and the plaster kind of melting down onto the outer limits of the frame. And up at the top, we have Wistful Haint lamenting her lost love who was lost at sea ages ago. And it was originally a figure, but it was so hokey, so I changed it to a little heron, and now I think it's just charming. There's the cat. The little girl was her name, and she's the one I lost to breast cancer. This one here is set in Ebenezer Creek, which is a cypress swamp nearby. This is actually maybe my favorite piece in the whole show. It felt really good to be painting on a small scale again. They just felt more intimate. And if you look close to this one, again, you'll see the impressions and the artifacts. And I just love this like natural wave that's happening from the gesso in that piece. This is the same bridge that you see in that piece over there. And then this is a plein air painting. It's the only plein air painting in the show. And I did this in January, side by side with other local artist, Tiffany Taylor. She did her own little ones, and I did this one, and we each had them in our thesis shows. This one actually inspired this. So it's the same marsh, but just thinking about that day, it was just such a beautiful day. These dancers kind of showed up, and I was listening to the music on The Nature of Daylight, which was on the Shutter Island soundtrack, but that composer is just amazing. So that piece is a tribute to the daylight. On The Nature of Daylight is also the title of the work. And it's about dissipating forms and trying to capture something as ethereal as sunlight, because it's always shimmering and changing, and it doesn't last. So this piece is entitled Ghost Story, very clever name. It's a narrative painting set in Savannah's Bonaventure Cemetery. So I actually painted this right after I eloped and got married. I went off to the Himalayas and got married to my husband. And when I came back, I was so happy and in love, but with every great love comes this innate, you're going to lose this person at some point, and you're aware of that. So this is kind of it's supposed to be a piece about love, but it's also impending loss. So we have a young bride here in the corner, and she's releasing lanterns. Bonaventure actually means good fortune. So it's about wishing the spirits well on their journey. And it also speaks to nonlinear time, because she's here, but she's also here as a haint in the cemetery. And her beloved, of course, is kind of fading away. This is also the first piece that I really used destructive methods on. So I used a power sander. Like when I was done with the painting, I liked it, but it didn't have anything edgy. It didn't have anything new. It was lacking emotion. I got frustrated. So I hit it with the power sander. And since I make my own gesso, you'll see a lot of natural textures in the piece. And when I went into it with the sander, all of those kind of came through. And the past layers also, some of this helped bring forward that concept of nonlinear time, making the layers coexisting on the same plane. So you'll notice a lot of pieces in this exhibit have earth tones and very warm ochre backgrounds. And again, that just speaks to the life cycle. Like, it's how I envision like the earth, the dirt, where we come from, where we return. So this one is also Bonaventure. This is one of my favorite statues there. This one actually was subject to more destructive methods than the previous ones, and many more layers. Instead of oil, we have acrylic here. And like if you look up in here, you'll see several layers that are literally like crumbling. I actually ended up liking that effect. A lot of people ask me if that was intentional. But it reminds me of my grandmother's old house, which is a colonial house. And when the paint starts to peel away, you'll see these, stains and layers underneath the surface veneer, which I find fascinating. It's the bones of the house. And for me, it's the layers of the painting. So, "Give my love to the world" is actually a quote that's on Savannah's famous poet Conrad Aiken's grave. It's actually something his wife used to say to him every day when he went out to town. And he put it on his monument, and I think that it's so fitting just because in a cemetery setting, give my love to the world from the other side. I think that's how it's meant to be interpreted. We start off with the marsh, and then these both are inspired by Bonaventure, so not much to the Bonaventure corner, other than I just put them together because they seem to belong together. So this piece is entitled Waltz Scene, and it is just that. It's several couples waltzing in an uncertain space. Again, it starts off with a very deeply abstract color field and many layers and lots of destruction in between the layers. Again, often I'll use etching tools, I'll use a power sander, and then I kind of go in and pull out layers and push layers back. You'll see a lot of interesting textural pieces happening in here. Some of my favorite parts of this piece are just like the really close-up details. I really enjoy how so little a gesture can carry so much weight. So some of these figures, like this is actually my favorite couple, and they really do appear to be lost in the layers. It's just mostly like daydreams, and they feel very ghostly. In part, it might be reminiscent of family childhood trips to the Haunted Mansion in Disney. There's all these holograms of people dancing. And I like the idea that people in the afterlife might be doing the things that they love to do in the real life. But it's more about nonlinear time than the actual afterlife, and the idea that you can peel back through these physical layers of paint and see something in the past that may be happening just behind the veil. So it really does start as like an abstract color field. So lots of paint, it's aggressive process, and the textural elements of the gesso really allow the paint to form a sense of depth because of the way it sits into the grooves and things like that. And then, yeah, I'll do different colors, more layers, sand them down, and figures last, and then some more destructive process, and then some more paint, and then somewhere in between all of that, it's done. So this is the tavern below the Pink House. It's called Planter's Tavern. I went there for a cocktail with a girlfriend, two girlfriends actually. They were sitting at the bar when I took this picture, and over time they slowly morphed into Victorian ladies. Everyone else in this, except for this character here, was present at one point or another. I used photo montage technique to kind of put them all in the same plane. This is James Habersham Jr., who is said to haunt the basement of the old Pink House. They say that he'll adjust napkins and place settings and things in between shifts. So he's just kind of another little element of whimsy. He's peeking at our Victorian ladies who are enjoying a drink at his bar. The playful thing about this is that you don't really know if it's past or present, or, this is Savannah. People may very well be dressed in Victorian garbs, or, anything goes. So, but it is about these different time periods existing on one plane. I just work very loose in general. A lot of my pieces are evocative of something either dissipating or forming. And so this visual language, which is working very loose and gestural in the initial stages, kind of evokes that feeling. So it's something that I just do kind of naturally, but it speaks to the content as well. So this is actually the oldest piece in the show. This is something I did in 2018, so 2 years ago now. This is actually the foyer of the Crescent Hotel in Arkansas, which is reportedly the most haunted hotel in the country. Evil Dr. Norman Baker used to make cancer elixirs that weren't real, so people would come to this hotel to convalesce and die, and really bad stories about what happened there. But no, I just was sitting in the lobby and just came up with a playful little scene. My biggest struggle has been how to know when to finish a piece. And this piece was important to me because I didn't finish it. And this is just where I stopped. And when I stepped away, I found that this is the most alive it had been, and I didn't want to take it to the point where I had worked it too much, that it lost emotion. So this is called Promenade. So in the olden days, and still in Europe, people used to walk the streets in the evenings, and it was the most social time. You could see anybody passing by. And you may recognize kind of an abstract version of Forsyth Fountain here in Savannah. This is another one that I did. This is the second oldest piece in the show. So I was also working with photo montage. I just went with my camera, I set it up on a tripod, I took tons of pictures. Everybody that you see, except for these two, in this frame was there at some point that afternoon. And then I kind of just placed them together. These two, my period people added up, they came along later. And this is another one where I was really fighting. Like, I had added Spanish moss and it was too finished. It looked stale at that point, so I took it back out. And this really vibrant, like earthy underlayer just contained so much energy compared to the greens. There was such a nice contrast between the warm and the cool that it's another situation where I just stopped painting and in the end, I enjoy the balance of the finished and the unfinished. So I think that's what gives the piece vitality. So it's destructive, not as aggressively, this piece. I don't know that I power sanded so much in this one, but I do use a rag and I burnish a lot. So I'll put down layers and I'll pull it back out. So when you look in this area, you'll see where a lot of the paint has been wiped away, and then you'll see that glow of the underpainting come through. This side. So this piece is, this is the first time I kind of wanted to take the painting off of the wall. I wanted to find a way to make the space engaging on a level other than just two-dimensional. So I got into kind of installation. So this is, it's a double-sided wooden screen. The outer dimensions are 6 feet by 6 feet. It's called All in a Sea of Wonder. This side here, which is the A side, depicts the marsh at dawn. So we have our Spanish moss, all the things that don't really exist together in the marsh, but just the way I wanted the marsh to look. So we have our southern live oak, we have a camellia tree, hydrangeas, peonies, because they're the most ethereal, and my favorite of flowers. We have a mama and baby alligator, and a peacock. It is an emblem of old world wealth, but it's also exotic. On that same honeymoon in the Himalayas, we saw peacocks in the wild in the jungle, and I just wanted to see a peacock in the marsh. I think that's a majestic bird that belongs there. So this is the B side. This is Southern Gothic Nocturne, so this is the night side. And again, it's a marsh scene. You all may recognize this bridge. It's near the hive. There's lots of turtles that like to live and swim in that area. And this piece was actually this is the first side that I actually started, and it's a moonlit scene. We have more of our dancing haints and a little ghostly cherub hanging in the tree. The little girl actually is a variation of a print at the Davenport house, the little girl that used to live there with her little dog. And the silhouette comes from Bonnard. It's just a tribute to one of my favorite painters. So this is the first piece in the exhibition. It's called The Swamp Cat. And I wanted to start off the show with a little bit of whimsy, since a lot of the subject matter is really heavy and a little bit bleak. So this is my cat, Marcello. I always promised him he'd be in a painting. It's based off of George Stubbs' White Poodle in a Punt I think it's from 1780. And I used to see that painting a lot when I worked at the National Gallery in DC. So it's always been kind of in the back of my mind. I guess that's the art historian in me. But instead of having it set in the English countryside, I have him set here in the Savannah Swamp. In this case, specifically Skidaway Island State Park. But yeah, it's just supposed to be a little bit comical. He's so grand, and he's got this opulent frame, and it's just a fun way to start off the show. The very warm, this is a variation of ochre. It's actually raw sienna, so it's a very vibrant undertone. I think one of the reasons Savannah and the Southern Gothic appeals to me so much is because of this. It's so vibrant, it's so rich, and it's so full of life and decay and the cycle of life. So for me, the marsh is an emblem of that, because it is all of that. You have the stench of decay, but you have the most lush life cycle that you can think of happening just there in the swamp. So I think that's why. So this is the last piece in the show. It's called On the Nature of Daylight. It's actually based off of the plein air painting that we talked about on the salon wall. It's the same setting. This one just wasn't done on site because it's so huge. It's about something as transient and temporal as daylight, which is always flickering and changing. And again, it's just about the ethereal and trying to capture something that's always changing and putting it into a painting immortalized. I was going to do colors, but this sort of, this really warm, almost sepia tone, it was one of those moments where it just felt good and it felt alive. And it dawned on me that because I was talking about something that was so transient and temporal, that this was the best color language, to use high tonal unity. Because if I had broken this up into color, they wouldn't be melting together into the landscape the way that they are now. So I did think about it, and I fought with it, but I do believe that for what I was trying to say, this was the best visual language. Yeah, so with this, and this goes for a lot of the large scale canvases, you'll see a lot of the burnishing. You know, you can see the rag marks. It's a very active process. And then it's terrible for you, but like I throw mineral spirits at the canvas. So you'll see all these splashings, there's almost bleaching it out. That's a different form of destruction. So that's why the paint looks like it's melting, like when you look in areas like this. Okay, were you on? There's a nice shady spot right there. So this is going to be very informal. I'm just going to read a short excerpt from the thesis and talk about a couple of the works that I brought here today. Are we on? So for those of you tuning in, thank you for joining us on the Virtual Artist Talk. We're here at Bonaventure Cemetery, and we are graced with an absolutely beautiful day, and I'm so happy it didn't rain, because I don't know what I would have done. And again, this is Sally Mericidal. This is some work I'm presenting now for my thesis exhibition. We just took a couple paintings out of the show so we could actually have an informal artist talk. So I'll start by reading this excerpt from the thesis. It's entitled Suffering the Sea Change. Ruin is a Path to Discovery. Full fathom 5 thy father lies. Of his bones are coral made. Those are pearls that were his eyes. Nothing of him that doth fade, but suffer a sea change into something rich and strange. The above lines from Shakespeare's The Tempest were sung by the supernatural spirit Ariel to Prince Ferdinand after his father's apparent drowning. Shakespeare's use of sea change is a literal one, meaning change brought about by the sea, eerily depicting a metamorphosis from man into an aquatic creation of coral and pearls. One can picture the faint resemblance of a corpse, having been adorned and transformed by the sea, drifting gracefully in the cool blue water. The poetic description of a corpse being repurposed by the sea is both horrific and lovely. Matter does not go away, it simply changes. It changes form and shape. It becomes something else. Death, like ruin, is an act of creation. Ruin is a two-sided coin. On one hand, it can mean a metamorphosis brought on by natural conditions, such as Prince Ferdinand's unfortunate father, ultimately feeding the cycle of life to produce new organic material. And on the other hand, the physical act of ruin, destroying something, marring it, taking risks by hurting it, can bring about an entirely new meaning or interpretation. It is reminiscent of Heidegger's call for the destruction of ontological precepts in the quest for truth. Sometimes we have to tear it all down and go back to the infancy of a process or idea, and in doing so, something new emerges. Throughout history, we have looked on ruins with romance, finding beauty in the decayed, archaic forms overwrought by nature. As nature reclaims at will, a new form is produced, which, according to George Simmel in his essay, The Ruin, is entirely meaningful, comprehensible, differentiated. And works such as Aftermath, which I did not bring here today, Give My Love to the World, and Ghost Story, were all subjected to the force of ruin through violent methods of deconstruction, such as power sanding and sometimes subtractive marks with etching tools. Ghost Story, set in Savannah's picturesque Bonaventure Cemetery, where we are now today, is a narrative work in which a young bride mourns the loss of her husband and simultaneously haunts herself as a haint in the cemetery, evoking a sense of nonlinear time. She releases lanterns as a means of wishing the dead well, a tribute to the setting, Bonaventure, which literally means good fortune. And this is the painting that I'm talking about here. This is the young bride, and our lovely model is here today recording for us on Instagram. She's here, but she's also a haint, kind of haunting herself on another layer of the panel. And this is the first piece that I got really angry with and went into with the power sander. And then something really beautiful happened after I thought that I'd destroyed it. It brought out all of the very expressionistic marks and the vitality of the sublayers that were painted over. I find as an artist, and I think a lot of us can relate to this, is that it's really hard to know when to step away from a work. And for me, that is when the work feels most alive. And sometimes I have to go back into it to try to take the work back. Sometimes it's not successful, but it's worth the risk because sometimes unexpected and wonderful things happen. The fissure that's formed here was a lantern, and when I hit it with the sander, it just took out the whole top layer of paint. Now it feels like she's really just opening up this portal between worlds. This is also the first piece that I used true gesso on, which is a homemade mixture. It has a lot of inconsistencies. So you see a lot of the things happening here with the brush strokes and they look like little orbs of light, all came through just because of the modulations in the surface texture. And that leads me to garden cemeteries and why I find them so inspiring. They're just rich and complex. They have this beautiful combination of life and death. It's the whole life cycle here. And it's really hard to be totally macabre when you're in a place that looks on death so fondly. One of the reasons I just love Bonaventure. And then I'll just finish this. Nature reclaiming form is the very essence of Bonaventure. Quiet death embraced by such a sweet surrounding evokes a sense of nature as a source of solace. We are bound to the earth. And that leads me to my own personal theory that we crave the soil and we have an innate desire to return to it. And I think that's why we love to go camping, immerse ourselves in nature. We crave salt water, and we garden because we need that contact with the earth from which we came. There's actually now scientific evidence that there are euphoric microbes in soil. So there's a good possibility there is a real truth behind that. So I find that very interesting. And then lastly, I'll talk about this piece. This is Aftermath. I'm sorry, not Aftermath. This is Give My Love to the World. This is one of my favorite monuments here in Bonaventure. And this piece was the first time I started embedding natural elements into the gesso. So some of the underlayers of this painting actually have some bits of dust and moss and things from the cemetery itself. The layers that are underneath look something like this, which is almost a finished work in itself. So we have a palm frond here, and these little sinuous lines here are the impressions of Spanish moss. And then, I'll throw dirt onto it. And I should also note that this one, when I go into the acrylic with layers of water, I use marsh water from Savannah's Moon River. So this piece is very much about a time and a place and embedding that into the piece. So on that note, I'm going to keep it short and sweet. Does anybody have any questions?
Do you have a favorite out of your show?
My favorite piece. This one. I'm glad you asked. That's why I brought it. So this is not the cemetery, but it's based on the ancient frescoes of Pompeii. I've been playing a lot with the techniques of layering and pushing layers back and pulling other ones forward, and it does evoke a sense a little bit of nonlinear time, but it also just looks ancient. So in this case, we have a woman gathering lemons and a little cat rubbing at her side. All these domesticated animals that you see in my work often, they're just there to present another element of solace and comfort from the natural world. Professor Knudsen, I liked what he said about this piece. He said that they were floating in a sea of chlorophyll in that bright green color, and I thought that that was kind of nice as well. It's always nice to hear someone else's insight. Anybody else? Anybody online, Monica? Yeah? No questions though. I think we'll sign off and just call it short and sweet. Thank you for joining us.
Make sure to smile. Not that anybody's gonna be able to.
Smile with your eyes.